of London. And I'm also co-chair of the AAPG Salt Basins Technical Interest Group. So yeah, it's a huge delight and honor to have Oliver Duffy here with us today. Oli is from AGL, the Applied Geodynamics Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. And he'll give us a talk, The Subsidence and Mobility of Minibasins, Insights from Natural Examples and Physical Modeling. So Oli received his undergraduate degree in geology from the University of Manchester and then conducted his PhD at the same institution. He studied components of rifting and salt tectonics and also tectonic geomorphology in the North Sea. He then moved to Imperial College where he spent 2.5 years as a postdoc. He investigated fault growth and evolution before finally joining the AGL in 2015. Since then, Oli has focused his research on salt tectonics. He has worked with a diverse range of basins and published over 20 papers in international journals, most of which focusing on salt tectonics. His areas of research include, amongst others, salt-influenced rifting, fold and thrust belts, and the behavior of minibasins. The latter of which is the focus of today's talk. So Oli, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us. Thanks again for accepting our invitation. And yeah, without further ado, I'll leave it up to you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Leo. Can you hear me all okay?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, so thank you very much, Leo, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. It's a great honour to be able to speak today and to follow Zoe's great talk from a couple of weeks ago. For the content of today's talk, the aim is to provide an overview and outline the current state of understanding as regards the subsidence and mobility of minibasins. And to do this, we're going to be using a range of approaches. So we're going to be showing some natural examples from across the globe. So we're going to be showing examples from the Northern Gulf of Mexico, Precaspian Basin, parts of the North Sea, and the Sivas Basin in Turkey. We're also going to blend that with some finite element modeling, some of the work of Nayara Fernandez, with some finite element models of minibasin behaviour, as well as some physical sandbox models from Tim Dooley, of minibasin behaviour. As you can guess by that introduction, this work is highly collaborative and represents not just my work, it represents the work of the entire group and people obviously beyond as well, as it incorporates existing literature in this talk. So I want to thank the co-authors here. So just a few photos there on the top row. So Nayara Fernandez, we're going to be showing some of her finite element modelling. Tim Dooley, we're going to be showing some of his physical modelling, and many of the concepts and ideas have been discussed and derived over the years. So thank you to those folks, as well as to Juan Soto and Jill Apps, who've obviously contributed as well through discussion. So thank you very much to those folks. Well, to get started, one of the first questions is, let's start simple and think about what is a minibasin. Okay. According to Jackson and Talbot in 1991, they defined a minibasin as a synkinematic basin that subsides into relatively thick salt. Now, we've got an example, an example of a single minibasin shown here. This is an example from the Northern Gulf of Mexico, and you can see you have a synclinal minibasin here, which is sunk down through the salt layer. You can see in this case, it's a relatively, it's not relatively, it's a very simple minibasin. It's sunk down all the way down to form a primary weld where it's welded to the base of the salt. In terms of the characteristics of the minibasin, in this case, it's relatively symmetrical, we can say that. And we can see that the internal units within the minibasin thicken towards the center of the minibasin and thin towards the flanks. The scales of minibasins can vary significantly. In this case, we're looking at a minibasin. This is on the order of 6-7 kilometers deep and on the order of 6 to 7 kilometers at the surface in terms of its map view diameter. However, minibasins are not all as simple as that, and they don't form in isolation. I think that's an important point. So minibasins form in provinces, I'm just showing you here now a couple of examples of some famous mini-basin provinces. So on the top left here, we have an example from the Precaspian Basin, or the southeast portion of the Precaspian Basin. And this is a top salt map. So the purples represent structural lows which host mini-basins, and the yellow areas and red areas are showing you salt diapirs, or shallow areas where you have a polygonal network of salt diapirs. So you can see those mini-basins are completely surrounded by diapirs. Now, in the case of the Precaspian Basin, it's a huge area. Precaspian Basin covers the area roughly aerially equivalent to the size of France, and there may be thousands, hundreds, if not thousands, of mini-basins contained within that. Just a second. There's a cat there making some noise. Sorry about that. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of mini-basins in that province. Likewise, on the figure on the top right here, we have an example from the North Sea here, where we have a series of those topographic lows, those purple areas. They're hosting mini-basins. So they are hosting mini-basins, and they're separated by some diapirs. And you can see that there are many diapirs present in here, and many mini-basins across here. So you can see the scale, or the scale there is in the order of 30-40 kilometers. In this case, we're talking 50 to 60 kilometers up and down, and 50 to 60 kilometers east-west. And finally, another example, another classic example, is on the northern Gulf of Mexico slope. So here we have this world-famous bathymetry map, where the northern Gulf of Mexico slope is pitted by many mini-basins, many hundreds of mini-basins, which are subsiding down into the salt and translating down slope. Okay. So mini-basins, they can, as I've mentioned, they can range in scale significantly. They can be on the orders of meters, or they can be many kilometers, up to 15 kilometers deep. So that's what we mean when we talk about mini-basin provinces. So why do we actually bother studying mini-basins? That's a fundamental question as well. Well, as I've mentioned, so mini-basins cover huge areas, and they can be repositories for vast amounts of continentally derived sediments. So in the case of the Precaspian Basin, as we mentioned, there's been hundreds, if not thousands, of mini-basins. And those mini-basins are storing vast amounts of sediment, and that's then providing an archive through which we can study, the tectonics, the climate, and the history, both on the continent and also the behaviour of the mini-basins themselves, also the conditions experienced by the mini-basins themselves. Mini-basins are also important in terms of sediment routing, because as mini-basins subside and deform and move, they can influence the topography and bathymetry, which can influence how sediments are dispersed across large mini-basin provinces. And finally, mini-basins are also important from a petroleum systems perspective, which maybe a lot of folks today may be particularly interested in. In terms of, you've got to understand how mini-basins subside. That can obviously be important from a basin modelling perspective. Also understanding when mini-basins weld and when they touch has significant influence in terms of understanding how fluids are transmitted through your petroleum system, amongst others. And so, yeah, so mini-basins have a wide degree of reasons to be studied. Now, another fundamental question is, why do mini-basins subside? Now, this can become an absolute minefield, but for today, we're just going to keep it simple. Just keep things within scope here, keep things on track. But essentially, on this figure on the top right, so at the top left, we see here we have a little cartoon sketch of a mini-basin sinking down into the salt. So a mini-basin will typically subside due to density-driven subsidence when the average density of the mini-basin fill, or the overburden fill, is greater than that of the salt. So that's when the average density is greater than that of the salt. So you're effectively looking at a buoyancy issue here, so a buoyancy problem. So when the average density is higher, you have a negative buoyancy and your mini-basin subsides. However, what we see is that the typical things, the typical overburden fill, the typical overburdens above salt are sands and muds. And in terms of the average density of these, they're relatively low. Okay. Now it turns out that in order to get a mini basin to subside on its own through density-driven subsidence, you need a thickness on the order of 2.3 kilometers. Now this was calculated in the Gulf of Mexico in a paper by Mike Hudek in 2009. But what we actually see in nature is that many mini basins subside much earlier, started to subside much earlier than when they've had 2.3 kilometers of overburden on top of them, okay, or fill. So how does this occur? Again, this is what this diagram in the bottom left is showing. This is showing a density plot. It's showing that the salt has a pretty consistent density of around 2,200 kilograms per meters cubed. In order for the overburden to overcome that in terms of its average density, it needs to be at 2,300 meters. Okay. Now, there are some scenarios that can explain why we get mini basins subsiding due to without requiring the 2,300 meters thickness of overburden. And that may be due to tectonic influence, or the influence of shortening, for example. Or it may also be due to if you have lithologies deposited immediately on top of the salt, such as carbonates or evaporites, they may set off density-driven subsidence without requiring such significant thicknesses. Okay, so I think that's all we really need to say for now. There's obviously a lot more information on that, and I'll point you to the work of Mike Hudek in 2009, and some of the more recent work by Banara Fernandez and Precaspian Basin, which touches on some of these issues of the density of salt and this average density issue. Okay, so let's take it for granted that we have mini basins subsiding. So how do we then study these mini basins? How can we understand how they have subsided? Well, to do that, we have to use minibasin stratigraphy. So as mini basins subside, they will obviously influence the topographic or bathymetric surface, and accommodation will be created that will be infilled by stratigraphy. Through time, you know, as a mini basin continues to subside, these stratigraphic units obviously will be recording that subsidence history and that tectonic history of the mini basin. And what's generally been found, I think the key paper of this is a paper by Matt Rowan and Paul Weimer in the 1990s, based on the Gulf of Mexico, and has been applied elsewhere in the Precaspian Basin more recently by a paper by Chris Jackson, is you can split up your mini basins into component stratigraphic units termed bowls, wedges, and layers, each of which is telling you about a different type of mini basin subsidence. So we can document this in this example from the Precaspian Basin. I think this is an example from one of Chris Jackson's papers in the Precaspian, where we have an example of a mini basin, here. And you can see the lower section here, the area coloured in yellow is what is termed a bowl. Now, if you do a mental rigid body restoration and bring that round so that the top of that bowl is horizontal, you can see that it's symmetrical. It will be thicker in its centre and thinner towards the flanks. Very much typical of what we kind of expect from a mini basin based on that kind of idealised view we kind of showed in the first slide. So these bowls, they are said to record simple kind of vertical subsidence and symmetrical subsidence of the mini basin. That's why both flanks thin, equally. Overlying that bowl, we have this big, thick green unit, which is clearly thickening towards the right-hand side. So that's a wedge. And that's telling us that the mini basin subsided asymmetrically. So there's asymmetric subsidence of the mini basin. And finally, you can get layers, which is the pink unit. And these record vertical subsidence, and they're typically associated with aggradation above a welded mini basin. So probably largely, in most cases, we're going to be looking at bowls and wedges to really understand and pick apart mini basin behaviour. For the rest of this talk now, what we're going to do is we're going to explore, now we're armed with this kind of way of studying mini-basins, we can explore some of the key controls on how mini-basins subside, and also how they behave under different boundary conditions, how they behave on slopes, or how they behave under tectonic influence. And I hope to kind of present just an overview of sort of some key processes that we think are important in terms of mini-basin behaviour. Okay, so we're going to present this in a series of key messages, 3 or 4 key messages, and then we will outline the evidence for that over 3 or 4 slides for each case study. So the first key message is that a subsiding mini-basin can influence the subsidence of adjacent mini-basins. So to kind of explain more what I mean by that, we're going to be using a finite element model. Okay, and this is the work of Naira Fernandez, who's very experienced with 2D finite element models. And so as I said, the aim here is to look at how the subsidence of one mini-basin can influence the subsidence of adjacent mini-basins. But to start off with, we have to start off with in the simple case. And we need to start off by looking at a single mini-basin, a single isolated mini-basin. So what we're looking at here is, I'm going to run an animation of one of Naira's models here. And we're looking at this pink unit is salt. So it's a 2D section, and with the pink unit being salt, and that has the numerical and numerically the properties of salt, viscosity, density, and such. And above that, Naira set up a seed of mini-basin on top, which is denser than the salt and which will simply subside through the salt. So it's important to state that in this case, we don't have any tectonic influence. It's just a simple, symmetric, isolated mini-basin. And so we're just going to see how that mini-basin subsides. Hopefully that will keep playing in the background. So as it subsides through the salt layer, you can see it's subsiding vertically. The mini-basin is not moving laterally. And you can see that the units within the mini-basin are symmetrical. So they're recording simple vertical subsidence. They're largely, typically balls, if not partially layers, due to the properties that Naira plugged in there. So yeah, we've got simple ball and layer stratigraphy when the mini-basin is isolated. But we've seen throughout that mini-basins don't form in isolation. They form in these provinces with multiple mini-basins. And these mini-basins are going to subside. There's going to be many mini-basins subsiding in a particular area. So what Naira did then is she set off 7 or 8 mini-basins subsiding within her model. Okay, so we're now going to be looking at this top left. So Naira set off 7 or 8 mini-basins above this salt. And just let's see what happens when multiple mini-basins start subsiding into salt. So we'll just keep that playing in the background. You can see that it's much more complicated now. You can see we've got many mini-basins there. And the most striking thing you can see is that some mini-basins subside quickly and weld out down at the base salt. And some subside more slowly. And so there's a temporal variation in mini-basin subsidence. You can also see that some of these mini-basins, if you look at some of these sections here, they show wedges. Okay, so these mini-basins are not just subsiding vertically; they're tilting. So they've got this asymmetric subsidence of the mini-basin, and there's clear tilting and wedging. Okay, so we're not just seeing simple ball-shaped units. And in fact, also I noticed this yesterday, is that these mini-basins actually move slightly a little bit laterally. If you look very, very closely there, these mini-basins are actually slightly shifting in position through time. I think that's something Naira mentioned in her paper, which I would definitely recommend a look at if this is something you're interested in. So the key question is, why, when you've got multiple mini-basins, do the subsidence histories appear more complicated? Well, to get at that, what Naira did, what she realized is that there's a lot of importance about what is going on in the salt, in particular, the velocity and the degree to which the salt is perturbed. Now, what we're looking at here is a series of outputs of the same model we've just seen, so with the multiple mini-basins. So the upper figure is a case early on, and the lowest figure is a more mature case where the mini basins are much thicker and many of them are welded out at the base. So you've got a sequential evolution. And you can see that the salt is coloured according to its velocity. So in the top case, the salt is largely green. You can see that salt is largely green here, and that indicates that the salt's not got much velocity. There's not much perturbation of the salt. It's not moving much because the mini basins have not really subsided much into it to perturb it. Through time, you can see, for example, here that by the third row down, you've got very strong reds and blues. That's indicating there's a huge amount of perturbation in the salt. Note that the dark blues indicate that salt is perturbed and has a high velocity towards the left, and the red areas indicate salt has a high velocity and is moving towards the right. And that perturbation is caused by the fact that there's lots more mini basin subsidence. There's lots more perturbation of the salt. Now, interestingly, if we look at that, we can see, if you look at this zone of red in here, this zone of perturbed salt and high velocity, you can see that it's clearly related to the subsidence of this mini basin 11. And the areal extent over which that red area, that perturbed salt, continues, extends beyond the adjacent mini basin, beyond mini basin 12. So the perturbations associated with mini basin subsidence have quite a significant effect over quite significant distances. So now, just to kind of reiterate this point, I want us to now look at mini basins 8 to 10 on this left-hand side, these left 3 mini basins. And just to document, this is quite a neat example, I think, of how mini basins interact. So early on, okay, we can see that mini basins 8 and mini basins 10 are subsiding quicker than mini basin 9. You can see it's much thinner, mini basins 9 much thinner. And what you can see is that the perturbation beneath mini basin 8 and from mini basin 10 is extending and passing into this area. So there's there's lots of pressurized salt and perturbed salt being pumped into this area beneath mini basin 9, which is why mini basin 9 is not subsiding. However, once mini basins 8 and mini basins 10 ground out, there's no longer any source salt to pump into the area beneath mini basin 9. And that allows mini basin 9 to subside quickly later on. So that's a neat way of how mini basins can interact with each other during subsidence. In this case, the subsidence of mini basins 8 and 10 is restricting the subsidence of the middle mini basin due to pumping salt and pumping high velocity salt into that area. Now, what Naira did is Naira went through and categorized some key styles. So that was just one example of how mini basin subsidence can be influenced by adjacent mini basins. So Naira just went through and categorized some basic styles. Now, these first two we've just explained. So you have single isolated mini basins, and then you have this case of 2 faster subsiding mini basins pumping salt and restricting the subsidence of a slower subsiding mini basin in the middle. You can then get a couple of these examples, which are quite neat. So in this case, now we documented, you start off with a case where you have a faster subsiding mini basin. Okay, this mini basin on the right is subsiding faster than the mini basin on the left. So as the faster subsiding mini basin continues to subside, it pumps out salt and perturbs the salt on the right-hand side of the mini basin here, and that pressurizes the salt in this area and causes that central mini basin to tilt. Okay? And that's what we see there. So that's where there is evidence of tilting. That's what's causing the tilting there. And then there's an example here where you have a mini basin here, which is welded out, a mature mini basin, formed a primary weld down at its base. But then if on one side of that, you get a new mini basin forming, when that mini basin subsides, it perturbs the salt and alters the velocities on the right-hand side of this large welded mini basin. And that then drives that mini basin to tilt away from that zone of pressurized salt. And this is going to become an important theme. The zone of pressurized salt or perturbed salt is becoming more and more important. Okay, so that's point 1. Mini basins, as mini basins subside, they can influence the subsidence of adjacent mini basins. The next thing to consider is that mini basins move. They're not just fixed in place. And minibasins can move due to two main processes, or two main processes. They can move due to gravity. So on salt-detached slopes, minibasins can move down salt-detached slopes. And minibasins can also be affected by tectonics. So shortening, extension, strike slip, that can affect the locations of minibasins. And we're going to show some examples of both and hopefully build up an argument for these things. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start off with the fact that minibasins move due to gravity on salt-detached slopes. Well, what do we mean by a salt-detached slope? Well, this is a kind of schematic view, a very simplified view of a salt-detached slope. So in this case, you can see that here we have a base, we have a slope, the base salt surface, which is smooth. Okay, and above that, we have our salt unit, and then we have in blue, we have the overburden. Okay, now, obviously, there's been tilt of this margin, and we're all familiar with this. There is, once you tilt something, you get upslope extension, mid-slope translation, and downslope shortening. Now, in this case, the overburden stratigraphy was initially relatively continuous. It was kind of isopachous. But if you were to have minibasins instead, more isolated minibasins deposited on that slope, they too would be expected to follow this same pattern of upslope extension, mid-slope translation, and downslope shortening, and therefore they would be mobile and moving largely downslope. So that's a kind of schematic model when the base of salt is smooth. But we know in many basins, many passive margins, the base of salt is not smooth. So we're now going to show an example of what happens to minibasins when they're on slopes, when the base of salt is not smooth. And we're going to start off with one case from offshore Angola, from Martin Jackson and Mike Hudek, who documented an example where the base of salt is stepped. Okay, so we have these relatively flat or gently sloping areas and some ramps on the base of salt. So in this figure, the upslope is to the right and downslope is to the left. So Martin and Mike actually completed a series of structural restorations for this portion of offshore Angola. And this is an example. This is a structural restoration from the top Miocene. And you can see we have a series of 5 minibasins separated by diapirs and a series of squeezed diapirs here. So we've got a series of 5 minibasins. Now what Martin and Mike did is they restored these 5 minibasins and showed where they were through time. And we can see here that essentially, as you went back in time, these minibasins were initially located further upslope. So you can see at the mid-Miocene, roughly mid-Miocene, there were a series of 5 minibasins here. And through time, those same 5 minibasins have migrated down the slope. Now that fits with what we've just said schematically on the previous slide. So minibasins will move down the slope. Minibasins will move down the slope due to gravity. But what was also quite neat from these structural restorations is that Martin and Mike showed that actually when minibasins are translating over flat base of salt or relatively low gradient base of salt, so for example here, between as this minibasin here moves from this star point here to this star point here, it moves over a relatively low gradient base of salt. Now what we've done is we can calculate that and calculate that the translation rate of that minibasin was 2.62 kilometers per million years during this interval between this structural restoration and the central structural restoration. However, during the subsequent structural restoration, the subsequent step, the same minibasin went over the ramp. Okay, and what you can see then, you can calculate that the translation rate increased to 3.8 kilometers per million years. So minibasins translate downslope, but they also can accelerate and speed up when they go over ramps, which is interesting. So that's one case. And that was a case where the base of salt is moderately rugose, we have those ramps and flats. But we're now going to go to a system where the base of salt is highly rugose. We're going to move back to the northern Gulf of Mexico and this beautiful bathymetric map that we've all seen before, where we've got these mini basins sinking into a salt canopy, and they're also, as they're sinking into a salt canopy, they're translating downslope. This is why we have this Sigsbee escarpment here. These mini basins are translating downslope, from upslope to downslope. Now we have a schematic representation here of what's going on in some parts of that northern Gulf of Mexico, and this is an example from Pilcher et al. And what you can see here is that the mini basins that are clearly affecting the topography and of the bathymetry are these yellow mini basins. These are these Supra-Canopy mini basins here. So these yellow mini basins have sunk down into this Sigsbee canopy. The blue mini basins represent a series of earlier mini basins. Okay? But we're essentially focusing on these yellow mini basins. So these yellow mini basins are wanting to they're subsiding vertically into the canopy, but they're also wanting to translate downslope. So the downslope direction is from north to south, and here we have the Sigsbee escarpment here. But you can see, as these yellow mini basins are subsiding, they're clearly going to be influenced by this blue surface, which is the base of the, effectively the base of the salt canopy. And you can see that the base of the salt canopy is pitted by feeders between these large primary mini basins. And the relief on these feeders is huge. It can be up to 10 to 12 kilometers. So it's a very, very Highly-Rugose complex surface. So we want to see now, how do those Supra-Canopy mini basins get influenced by that complex base of salt as they translate downslope? Well, let's just look at a couple of examples now, a couple of seismic examples of some of these mini basins, and let's see what they look like. So here we see some raw seismic. Now, I'm going to show you two examples. Now, from these, the upslope is to the left and the downslope is to the right. So everything is wanted to translate from left to right. But let's see what it looks like when you interpret it. Okay. So remember, we're talking about the yellow mini basins. We can see that effectively the basal surface that these mini basins are translating across is effectively this line here. So it's the top of this primary mini basin going down into this feeder and then up along here. So what we can see is that this yellow mini basin, this Supra-Canopy mini basin, sorry about that mini basin has subsided down all the way through, the feeder between the primary mini basins, and has formed a weld right down at the autochthonous level. It's also welded on its flanks. So this is a bucket mini basin that's gone all the way down. And it's important to know that on its downslope flank, the relief, the kind of elevation difference between the top of this primary mini basin and its base is on the order of 9 to 10 kilometers. So that's taller than Mount Everest, okay? So that's a huge wall that this mini basin is welded against. You can also see that, so you've got a welded mini basin. You can also see that on the upslope side of this mini basin, you've got this small mini basin here, which appears to have welded with the bucket mini basin. So that indicates that there's previously salt in between here, and these two mini basins have welded together. That's typically in salt tectonics the concept of shortening. So there's up dip of your mini basin here, your mini basin caught down a feeder, you have shortening. On the downslope side, you have extension. Okay. That's a motif, and that seems to be quite common. And we're going to show another example here now. So this is another example. You can see again, you have a mini basin here, which is welded to the base of salt. And here the base of salt is actually dipping landward. Okay, so you've got a landward dipping base of salt, and you've got a mini basin on a primary weld. Okay. On the upslope side, again, we see shortening. We see a beautiful fold and thrust where this section appears to have bumped into the back of this area. A beautiful fold and thrust, almost cartoon-like. And on the downslope side, we have some extensional folds. Okay, so we have welded mini basin, upslope shortening, downslope extension. That pattern is common across the chunks of the Gulf of Mexico. So how can we explain that concept? How can we explain that motif, that deformation pattern? Well, we can do this with a very simple cartoon, and by bringing in the concept of obstructed mini basins. or of obstructed minibasins and unobstructed minibasins. So what we mean by that is that if you have, during the early stage evolution of your minibasins, they're quite thin, they're immature, they're subsiding vertically, and they may be translating downslope. But because they're relatively thin, their bases do not interact with the base of salt. So the minibasins just freely carry on translating downslope. However, it only takes 1 or 2 minibasins to get thick enough that they subside, and perhaps they weld down at the base of salt. They ground out, forming a primary weld. Okay? Once they do that, they make that minibasin, because obviously it's going to experience friction at its base. Furthermore, the minibasin may also bump into buttresses, which restricts its downslope translation potential. So when that happens, this large minibasin now becomes a minibasin that we term obstructed. Its ability to flow freely downslope is clearly impinged. In contrast, the thin minibasins, they don't care that minibasin is obstructed, and they keep continually flowing down the slope. So in this case, minibasins further upslope, they just bump into the back of those obstructed minibasins, and that will be why you see shortening, why you see welds, folds and thrusts, and the like, squeezed diapirs. In contrast, on the downslope side, again, that salt and its overburden will continue just translating and pulling away. And as it does so, it creates an extensional breakaway system. Okay? So we're seeing that pattern of obstructed minibasin, upslope shortening, downslope extension. Now what we did is we mapped this out over a chunk of the northern Gulf of Mexico, and we can see that it's not just 1 or 2 examples where this motif occurs. Now I know this map looks a little bit confusing for now, but it's actually rather simple. The yellow polygons here, actually I should say that the upslope, we're looking at a map view here of a portion of the northern Gulf of Mexico, and the upslope is to the northwest here. This is the upslope portion, and this is the downslope side. Okay. This is a Sigsbee escarpment in here. So we've got these different coloured polygons. But let's just focus our attention just purely on the yellow ones for now. So the yellow ones, the yellow polygons, are telling us where minibasins are obstructed. So that is where any minibasin is welded down to the base of salt. That minibasin is said to be obstructed. And you can see we have a raft of those minibasins. We have a wide array of those minibasins, a lot of them. We can also see that we've got some purple and blue polygons. The purple polygons are telling us where we see evidence of shortening in the Supra-Canopy stratigraphy. And the blue polygons are telling us where we've got extension. So if we follow that idea that we had in the previous slide, that for every obstructed minibasin, you'd expect to see upslope shortening and downslope extension, we can actually see that mapping out on this map. And I'll just show you a couple of examples to draw your eye to them. So let's take minibasin 9. We have an obstructed minibasin. Upslope of that, we have shortening, purple zone, downslope extension. The same pattern is seen at minibasin 8. Upslope shortening in purple, downslope extension in blue. And you can see this in minibasin 7, the same pattern. Portions of minibasin 5, minibasins 3, 2, 1, all have the same general pattern. They can become a little bit more complex. There are some caveats to that, but the closer you look at these types of systems, the more you realize that it all makes sense. And so what it means is that, this portion of the Gulf of Mexico, this northern Gulf of Mexico, was actually, the portion we studied was actually in the lower slope section. Now, because you're in the lower slope, we would expect us to be in a purely shortening terrain. So all of the polygons here, you would expect to be largely purple, but obviously we're seeing lots of extension. So we're seeing the effect of this obstruction process is clearly affecting how strain, the pattern of strain on salt-detached slopes. And we can just reiterate that with a simple cartoon here, where if your minibasins are thin and not interacting with the base of salt, the minibasins will just continue moving away downslope, and they will behave in a manner where the structural zonation of the slope, it will just fit the standard structural zonation of a slope. So the upslope section will have extensional faults and extensional geometries. mid-slope translation, and downslope shortening, because nothing is interfering with that. Once your mini-basins get thick enough, however, and will start interacting with the base of salt, so you may have mini-basins here. So you may have your mini-basins here having fallen down feeders or bumping into downslope buttresses. You can see that what happens then is you get those zones of upslope shortening associated with each of those obstructed mini-basins, and downslope extension. So essentially what that's doing is it's making a much more complex terrain pattern. And you can see effectively kind of creating little mini gravitational cells in between your obstructed mini-basins, where you have upslope extension here and shortening there. And it repeated little cells in between your obstructed mini-basins. And that's really complicating the distribution of extension and shortening on the slope compared to when your mini-basins aren't touching down at the base of salt. Okay, now the final kind of thing I want to get at is that mini-basins can move due to tectonic forces. Okay, now that may be shortening, extension, strike slip, whatever. In this case, we're just going to focus today on the effects of shortening. And just purely for the effects of time and the fact that that's something that as a group we've been focusing on for the last few years. And to do this, I'm going to display some of Tim Dooley's physical models. Okay. Now, in this model, we look at, just to get started, I'm going to show you, this is an underside view of a sandbox model. So it's like we're lying on the ground with a camera, taking a picture or taking a movie, shooting a movie of a model. You can see that we have 6 mini-basins here. So these circular areas are showing us the bases of mini-basins. And these mini-basins are relatively deep. They're subsided quite a long way into the salt. And you can also see these green markers. These are contained within the salt, and they are there to allow us to see how the salt is moving. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to have a moving end wall come in from right to left, and it's going to shorten this setup. Okay. So hopefully this movie plays. Hopefully it has. Okay. Okay, I'll just leave that there. So what we see, the moving end wall has come in from the left-hand side, it's moving towards the right. Now, what's happened is that shortening, you've got a system there where you have these relatively mechanically strong mini-basins, and the salt is the relatively weak component of the system. So as the moving end wall comes in, the shortening is taken up by the salt. The mini-basins themselves don't really deform. And what's happening is, and I'm going to let this movie play in a second, is that the shortening is induced flow of the salt. And we can see the evidence of that flow of the salt based on these markers, okay, in the salt. You can see that the salt is flowing in the direction of shortening. And you can actually see some neat strain patterns on the roof of the model, the very thin, negligible roof of the model here, is indicating that things are flowing. So now I'm just going to let that run to its end. So again, what's happening is that flowing salt is propelling the mini-basins. So the mini-basins are also moving. The mini-basins are clearly moving laterally in the direction of shortening. And in the case of these two cases here, the mini-basins are colliding and interacting with one another. So they're forming secondary welds and actually spinning and rotating around one another. So at the end of that model, we can see that the flow patterns are quite complex, okay? And our mini-basins have translated during shortening. So as we said, the key message, mini-basins move. In this case, they're moving due to the flowing salt. They're being propelled by that flowing salt. Now I'm going to show another example of one of Tim's models. And this is a slightly more complicated one. In this case, we have many more mini-basins in there, but we don't need to get too bogged down with the details of these scenarios. And essentially, I just want you to look here and look at the behaviour of some of these mini-basins as the system shortens. And I'd like you in particular to keep your eye on this mini-basin here. Okay, so the one that says has non-welded mini-basin array above it. Just keep your eye on that early on in the shortening. So we've got the same scenario, but we're going to have, again, we're going to have the moving end wall coming in from left to right. So first off, just keep your eye on this mini-basin here. Now I'll try and stop it at an adequate point. You can see that it's actually rotating anti-clockwise, really gently rotating anti-clockwise. Okay, so some of those mini-basins, as a result of the flowing salt and the traction exerted on those mini-basins, it's actually rotating in map view. Now I'll let the rest of the model run, and just keep your eye on some of these spinning and rotating mini-basins. So for example, this one here, rotating clockwise, this one rotating, and this mini-basin here now starts to spin. It starts to roll as it's bumped into by the mini-basin further up dip. So mini-basins spin both as a result of likely shear on their margins, but they also spin and rotate as a result of collision and welding. As mini-basins collide, they pivot against one another. And so that's another reason, another kind of type of behaviour and process that we need to consider in terms of mini-basin behaviour. So just to summarise that key point, so when you get shortening of mini-basin provinces, you get three key types of mini-basin mobility or mini-basin behaviour. First off, mini-basins translate, as we saw. They clearly move and they're pushed and they're propelled by flowing salt and salt streams within there. And you can see here we have an example early on of the early configuration of the mini-basins, and later on, this is what they look like. They've all clumped together, kind of like marbles or like pool balls. They're moving much closer together, they're clumping together. You can see that here in as well. We have a section here which is located, oriented through here. So you hit SMB2, SMB3, this is mini-basin 2 and this is mini-basin 3. You can see these two mini-basins, they've collided. And you can see here you've got a vertical secondary weld between those mini-basins. So that is typical of these types of systems. We also see that mini-basins, we see that mini-basins rotate through time, as we've just shown in that movie. We see these mini-basins can rotate clockwise, anti-clockwise, they can pivot on one another, and then it may be affected by flowing salt. And we also see that mini-basins can actually have quite complex tilts. So back on this figure here, we have early on, you can see that the tilt direction of these mini-basins is relatively consistent and is one way at an early stage in the shortening, whereas at a later stage, the mini-basins, the tilt is highly complex and appears to have shifted all over the shore. And some of the controls on that are likely to be mini-basin collisions. So for example, mini-basin 2 and 3 have collided, so that's going to affect the tilt of your mini-basins. The local salt pressures, as we talked about with, you know, when Nyara mentioned that the subsidence of one mini-basin can be affected by the subsidence of another mini-basin, and that was all due to the pressures and the velocities in the salts. That's kind of what's happening here. When you get the shortening, it's pressurizing the salt in different locations, and it's resulting in quite complex tilt patterns, with mini-basins tilting away from those areas of pressurized salt. So I just want to this is the final slide before the conclusions, and I want to get on to the questions or discussion. And these are two examples of where those scenarios have occurred. First off, this is an example, or these are examples of shortened mini-basin provinces. So just to prove that we're not just doing sandbox modeling of this, there are actually some neat examples. So the first example is a case from the Precaspian Basin, which is a mildly shortened system. So here you can see, we've seen this figure before. The mini-basins are quite tightly packed, particularly in here. You can see that the walls between the mini-basins are quite thin, indicating that they've collided together. Okay, they've translated and collided together. That's the Precaspian Basin. And this is a beautiful example from the Sivas Basin, from the folks at POR, who've been doing great work on this over the last 10 or so years. And this is an example from the Sivas Basin where a basement involved fold and thrust belt has propagated northwards into this system. And you can see here that the mini-basins, they've all basically clumped together. They all share welds between one another. Okay, and many of these welds have actually become thrusted. You can see that some of the mini basins have actually, it's almost like the salt has greased the wheels of some of this shortening and has actually upturned some of these mini basins. So this mini basin is completely upturned. And I think a key thing when we think about shorter mini basin provinces as well is the fact that the mini basins aren't deformed. Okay? Internally, they're undeformed. They may be rotated, but they don't show folds or thrusts because all the shortening is accommodated by the salt. So, to conclude, we've seen that the density and buoyancy of mini basins is key. We've seen that mini basins subside when the average density of the mini basin fill is greater than that of the salt. But there are some specific boundary conditions that can change that. We know that mini basins can move, that mini basins subside vertically, and they can also move laterally, either due to tectonics, as we've just shown there with the shortening case study, or due to the influence of gravity. In the case of gravity, mini basins will move until they can move no more, i.e. until they bump into a buttress or that they weld at their base, and that can result in that complex strain pattern, as we saw in the northern Gulf of Mexico. We also need to know that mini basins are not completely independent bodies. They may move independently, but as they subside, the subsidence of one mini basin can perturb salt and influence the subsidence of adjacent mini basins. And with that, I'd like to close and hope that's been of use to you.
Thank you, Ollie. On behalf of the AAPG, we really do appreciate your time for giving this excellent talk. And we also want to join everyone who has joined us. So now I will open up for questions, and I will start by reading questions from the Q&A tab. And if you have more questions, please enter these into the Q&A section or raise your hand and we will allow you to speak. So the first question is from Neil. So his question to you, Ollie, is interesting. The stratigraphy within your mini basins contain no fault. Do borehole data show whether the material is indurated? Perhaps the weakness of the surrounding halite prevents differential stress rising to levels needed for faulting.
That's a good question. I mean, we don't deal significantly with borehole data. I guess we're largely looking at things on the seismic scale and on this kind of relatively regional scale. In the case of these mini basins, I mean, from the physical models, essentially we've shown that, particularly in the case of the shortening, even when the mini basins collide, there isn't internal deformation within the mini basin. It's more a case of deformation being taken up by the salt. In terms of the faults, I mean, I guess, of course, we've simplified things and we're not dealing with, for example, turtling or some of the anticlinal structures that can form after welding. But I can't say we've dealt particularly with the borehole data or looking at some of the things mentioned there. But I would imagine, I think the key point I would be making at the scale that we're looking at things is that the salt is the weakest component, and therefore that takes up the deformation. Beyond that, I'm sure there are people in the crowd who know much more than I.
Right. So we've got another question from Bjorn. Why does salt velocity have opposite values in both sides of the subsidence?
That's a good question. I think I can see why that confusion arose. So that was on the finite element modeling of Nara-Fernandez. And so what that was we had those, as those mini basins subsided, we had red and blue areas of perturbed salt to the left and right of the mini basin. And what that was, it was just showing, I guess, when the salt was red, it was flowing to the left, and when it was blue, it was flowing to the right, or vice versa, I think. So it was just, I think you just really need to take it in terms of the strength of color. The exact color didn't matter. That was just showing which direction. The color was showing the direction of salt flow, and the kind of the strength of the color was showing how fast. So that's why they would have, that's why salts on either side of a subsiding minibasin, it would flow each way, left and right.
Yeah. Another question from Gordon. Thanks for a great talk and wonderful illustrations. Can you expand on the differences in Minibasin Stratigraphy that you might anticipate between results of the 2D numerical models you showed and those if the deformation was simulated in 3D?
Ooh, so let's see about that. Well, I mean, that's a very good point, and that's, of course, minibasins are 3D, quite complex bodies, and so taking any 2D section through them, you may, in one orientation, something can look like a ball, and you may think, oh, that indicates symmetrical subsidence. But when you take that look at that same interval in a different orientation, it can look like a wedge. So that's an important point to consider. Definitely, you need to map these horizons in 3 dimensions and look at them in map view. In terms of, so can you expand on the differences? So how, if this was simulated in 3 dimensions, how would it change? Well, of course, so minibasins, I mean, in this case, we had the minibasin interactions purely in the plane of the section. Of course, you would have some complexities. I mean, I think that's something that probably needs to be done to actually examine in further detail. But I think the same principles would hold. You would just have to think in the 3rd dimension. I think the principles would hold, but you would have to think in that 3rd dimension. So it's a very good question. But off the top of my head, I'd have to think a little bit more closely if there was something obvious I've missed there.
Yeah, sure. So we've got another question from Mohammed. What is the effect of the regional tectonic rifting on the mini-basin tectonics? For example, the Red Sea Basin, which show extension and contains a lot of salt structures that is currently under exploration.
So what is the effect of the regional? Well, if you're dealing with extensional systems, and this is, again, I'm talking without having looked at this or thought about this huge amounts. So I guess the question, so we showed the example of regional tectonic shortening on minibasins. In terms of extension, I guess some of the effects of extension, you expect to see extensional faults between your minibasins if there was any roof in between them. I would also expect to see, you'd be looking for features such as diapier fall. So if your minibasins welded out and grounded out at their base, and the diapiers between minibasins extended, that salt would eventually thin, and you'd get a new minibasin forming above the diapiers. Again, I'm not familiar with the Red Sea, but probably that sort of, there has been work done on that, and I'd probably point Mohammed to the Salt Tectonics textbook from Jackson and Hudek. I'm sure that is very well explained, and yeah. Apart from diapier fault and extensional faults, I'm not too sure.
Right, I'll move on to the next question, which says, the whole mini-basin story starts with sedimentation above thick pervasive layer of salt. Can you think about mechanisms focusing sedimentation in particular areas?
Oh, this is, that's the nightmare question, because I simply don't know. It's a very difficult question. This is a fundamental question that I think with AGL, I think we've had many jokes about this, that it's really not clear. I think, I mean,
yeah, that's fine.
Sorry?
Sorry for jumping in.
If you know, I don't know, Peter. That is a difficult question. I tried to hint at that in the slide, indicating that it can be a minefield, and how these things get out there, whether it's something to do with the depositional systems, little lobe geometries that start and differentially load systems. I'm not too sure about that at all. It's a very difficult, it's a fundamental question. very good fundamental question.
Okay, Ollie, that's fine. I just wondered, because I think we have about 13 more questions. Do you want to carry on, or would you answer a few more and then we can email the rest to you?
I'll carry on as long as people are interested. You know, I mean.
Okay. Okay, I'll carry on then. Just let me know.
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm okay. Don't worry. It's early.
Okay, fine. So we've got another question from Nazar, which, by the way, says this is an excellent presentation. So, is it only the salt and sediments or density contrast which creates mini basins, or tectonic forces have any play to create mini basin other than reshaping?
Again, that's a very good question. I kind of skipped over this. So you can get, so obviously we only talked about density contrast, but I kind of hinted that there are some other scenarios that can kind of help your mini basins. And one of them in particular is shortening. So if you have shortening, it kind of creates folds in the salt. And what happens is that when you squeeze the salt, especially if you have mini basins partially formed already, is that the salt in between rises and the diapirs rise in between the mini basins. And that essentially kind of rises the salt above regional. And this then creates accommodation where the mini basins are. So therefore, that is, although the mini basins may not be subsiding due to density, the rising salt in the diapirs is actually creating accommodation. Mm-hmm. So yes, that can definitely create mini basins, although once the shortening actually is removed, the effect of the shortening is removed, those salt ties will return back down to regional, and you know, you won't have those mini basins subsiding on their own. It's only due to the tectonic forces which is creating that local apparent subsidence. And again, for Nazir there, I'd point him to the Mike Hudek 2009 paper, Hudek et al. Mini basin paradox of mini basin subsidence. That essentially goes through 4 or 5 case studies about how that can happen. And so that would probably be a more effective way to get into this in detail.
Right. We've got 2 questions actually from Roman. And he says, is the rotation of mini basins only driven by tectonic or other mechanisms? And can we identify if the mini basin has been rotated?
So, yeah, mini basin rotation is an interesting concept. Well, in terms of identifying how a mini basin has been rotated, obviously we had Tim's physical models, and we had the luxury of being able to actually see them rotate through time. In a natural system, and we've looked at this, and we've not actually found it too easy to document so far, is you'd be looking for offset channels, I think, would be the prime thing to see. So, you know, if you have a depositional system running through between a number of mini basins, you may, you know, within a given mini basin, it will have an entry point and an exit point. If that mini basin is rotated since the channel was active, you will see that your depositional system won't connect to the mini basin up dip. So that's probably the nicest way and the neatest possible way to see if a mini basin is rotated. Obviously, you need good quality seismic or good quality mapping to be able to determine that. But that's we're looking for that. I think that will be an excellent thing to see. Now, it must be said that our mini basins were completely circular, so that may have facilitated the rotation. In other cases, mini basins might not be quite that circular, and it might not be as easy to rotate. Okay. And as well as the tectonics, so mini basins could also rotate on welds. So we've said that mini basins can collide and bump into one another. That would drive rotation. But they could also rotate perhaps if they just subsided vertically and were, and kind of tilted or rotated on quite a complex weld. So it could pivot on that weld and rotate. And there may be some flowing salt as well, depending on the subsidence of adjacent mini basins. So yes, I think mini basins can rotate by a variety of mechanisms. It's seen in the physical models, but it's not. It's in nature we need to prove this, I think.
Cool. We're getting lots of really positive comments in the chat, by the way. So thank you so much, for all the answers. I'll take some few more questions. So there's one from Gordon. And he says, how would you expect minibasins to interact with topography associated with carbonate platforms and pinnacles?
Oh. I have to think about that. How do you think topography?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I can run through the next question and we can always.
Carbonate platforms and pinnacles is not my area of expertise, so I'd have to think about that. And maybe, I don't know if you could send me a list of these questions and I can try and answer them afterwards with a bit of thought if I've missed some out. So that would be, I would also be happy to do that. I'll be contacted separately. If I can be of use, I'll try my best.
Okay, that's fine, Ollie. So I'll just take one last question and we'll email you the rest of the questions. So this one is from Mark, and he says, most of your models and examples contain isolated minibasins completely surrounded by salt. What do you expect when it's larger, partially connected minibasins and more isolated diapers?
Oh, that's another good question. So it depends on which aspect we're talking about. If we just went back to the beginning and thought about the subsidence of one minibasin affecting the subsidence of adjacent minibasins, how that would behave with a slightly moderate mechanically strong roof, that we would need to test, I think. And Nayara, if she's watching, might think that is something of interest, or maybe she's thought about that before. In terms of the situation with shortening, which I think I'm probably best placed to talk about, we talked about shortening with isolated minibasins, and we saw that the minibasins were all behaving as independent bodies, and they were mobile, and they were translating laterally, they were tilting, and they were rotating in map view. If you had a case study which is somewhat similar to, say, the Zagros, where you had isolated diapirs surrounded by sediment in kind of 3 dimensions, and I think that's what Mark is getting at there. When you squeeze that type of scenario, it's got a very different mechanical framework. It's got a very much different rigidity to the system, because the whole sediment body is connected. So when you squeeze that, you get a lot more faults. You get a lot more faults and folds nucleating at diapirs and propagating away from those diapirs. And so you get a much more complex fault and fold network than you would in a very simple fold and thrust belt where you had no salt at all. And so this was addressed in a pair of papers, one of which has just come up available on preprint, which is the situation we've just talked about today with isolated minibasins. When you've got isolated diapirs, we had some sketches and diagrams of what happens when you squeeze an isolated diapir province. And I'm also aware that Mark has published on examples from the Gulf of Mexico, where many systems are actually, they're a combination of both isolated diapir and isolated minibasin scenarios. And I think that's an important thing to consider. What we've shown here is very much an end member, and that, there are isolated minibasin provinces.
Yeah, that's great.
I would just direct people to those 2 papers in Journal of Structural Geology and then on Earth Archive. I think. Right.
Thanks, Ollie. It's been a very engaging presentation, and there's just a lot of interest. So we will email you the rest of the questions. So if we have not gotten to your question today, we will email the rest of the questions to Ollie if you do not have his contact. Also, please feel free to reach out to us at aapgsaltbasins@gmail.com, and we can forward your questions to Ollie. Additionally, we will post a recording onto our YouTube and social media outlets. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. So feel free to comment and engage with us online. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We look forward to speaking to you again at our next webinar on the 3rd of August by Conor O'Sullivan from ICRAG. That's the Irish Centre for Research in Applied Geosciences. And his talk will focus on multi-layered soil systems in the Irish Atlantic margin. So before I go, I just want to open up to the other panelists, Leonardo, Michelle, Clara, team. Is there anything else to add before we end the meeting?
All great. Thank you, Oli. It was a great presentation.
Thank you, Clara.
Thanks, Oli. Really appreciate it.
All right, yeah, thank you, Oli. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I think see you all in 2 weeks.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
See
you.
you
See you in 2 weeks.